It is important to note that this inmate's personal history is sealed as a professional courtesy due to her outstanding level of cooperation with organizational goals. In addition to her generous financial contributions and her active participation in the organization's medical division, Miss Sorrow has consented to serve in a T-class capacity. For a general overview of her duties, please review the file for Inmate 19. Please direct any questions or concerns regarding Miss Sorrow's conduct directly to administration. Interview subject: Petra Sorrow classification, string, cooperative, destructible, Gaian, constant, low Phallos. Interview Rachel B. Interview date 12/9/24. My family owned a people farm, so you won't be surprised to learn that my father was a sick man. What might surprise you is, he was literally sick. He suffered from an unspecified autoimmune wasting illness, and it was hereditary. We all had it. Me, Dad, my brother Peter. Yeah, you heard right. He's Peter, I'm Petra. Dad said he gave us those names because his children were the rock on which he built his life. He was always saying stuff like that. I miss him. As with most autoimmune disorders, our symptoms were legion, deadly serious, but also vague as hell. Here's a rundown of the major ones. If we got scratched, we'd bleed for hours. Nosebleeds turned into legitimate emergencies. We bruised easily, too. I swear to God, a brisk wind could make me look like I just lost an MMA match. We also had a ton of food sensitivities, and our digestive tracts couldn't absorb nutrients effectively, no matter how much we ate. The only thing that helped us break down nutrients was a super specialized, super expensive, super illegal supplement from a pharmaceutical company based in South America. It was horrendously expensive. Dad couldn't even afford it unless he worked overtime. But OT is pretty thin on the ground when you're a single father of chronically ill twins. But there came a point when Peter especially got so sick that Dad didn't have a choice. He had to work all the time just to make sure his kids didn't starve. This is incredibly messed up, but I was relieved when the overtime started. I was happy to trade my dad's life for the ability to eat. Modern parenthood in a nutshell. But in my defense, I was trading my life too. We were all sick, but Dad was sicker than me and Peter was sickest of all. That made me the de facto caretaker. Not just for Peter, for Dad too. Being sick is hard. Taking care of sick people, even when you love them more than anything, is harder. Taking care of sick people when you're sick is a recipe for misery. And I was miserable. We all were, but at least we were fed. Once we got that supplement consistently, Peter and I finally improved. We were still frail, the bruises stopped, so did the nosebleeds, the exhaustion too. It looked like we were all going to have normal lives, after all. And then my dad got sick. The kind of sick that doesn't get better, no matter how much vitamins or medications or tender loving care you choke down. Of course, I was his caretaker. Peter tried to help, but he ended up causing more problems than he solved. It's not his fault. Caretaking is a skill, one he never had to learn. But instead of learning it, he ran away. He contacted a distant relative and took off, leaving me to do all the work all by myself yet again. The stress of it all made my symptoms come back no matter how much of that supplement I ate. So on top of being a caretaker, I was declining too, and there was no one to help me. Dad got sicker and sicker. Insurance hit its cap, doctors gave up, and Dad finally came home on hospice. He declined fast. The bleeding wouldn't stop in general. The bruising got wider and deeper until it opened into sores that wouldn't heal. Infections set in, everything from staph to UTIs. That's how I discovered his self-harm scars. Old and new, shoulders to wrists, thighs to ankles, like he'd been cutting himself every single day since I was born. I never even knew. Those scars were the first things to degrade and open up into wounds. Even though they pumped him full of painkillers to make him comfortable, he still cried in his sleep. That made me cry too. One morning after the hospice nurse left, he woke up in a mild delirium, which is common for end-stage hospice patients, or so I've been told, and said, "The secret of immortality is death." Then he went back to sleep and didn't wake up. When he stopped breathing, I called the funeral home, then went to work. Doesn't matter how sad or tired you are, when you're broke, you work. And while I was working in the immediate aftermath of Dad's death, Peter came back just long enough to swoop in, claim the body, and move it to another funeral home for burial instead of cremation. I was furious. Dad specifically wanted cremation. But Peter said Dad only picked cremation because it was cheaper, that he'd worked himself to death for us, and so the least we could do was a burial. "Who's gonna pay for it, Peter?" I screamed. "I'm taking care of it. You just take care of yourself, pet." He hung up. I called back probably 200 times, but he didn't answer once. I had no way to find him. He never even told me where he'd moved to. But that was in character. Peter always flitted from girl to girl, relationship to relationship, job to job, life to life. That's the kind of thing you have time for when everyone else is doing your work for you. I don't even know what I expected from him. Understanding, I guess. Acknowledgement. A thank you for taking care of them, even though I was sick too. An apology for never taking care of me. I think part of me wanted him to come back so I'd have something to take care of again. When you're a caretaker, especially a young one, it defines you. I had been defined by my father's illness for years by that point, and by my brother's sickness my entire life. It was what I did and who I was. So now, with Dad dead and Peter gone, I was nothing. A caretaker with no one to care for. For the first time in my life, I was alone with myself. It was a disaster, one that culminated in the return of my illness. My symptoms had already resurfaced due to the stress caused by Dad's illness, but that resurfacing deepened to a full-on resurgence. I was sick, and as ever, there was no one to take care of me. After about 6 months, my doctor told me I was dying. The day I made peace with it, Peter came back and threw what remained of my world into chaos. He turned up on my doorstep like no time had passed. Worse, he looked healthy, beautiful even. He was glowing. And there I was, withered and literally dying. I've never wanted to punch anyone so hard or yell so long, except maybe my dad for dying in the first place. All that resentment, all that rage came erupting out of me in a tirade. Years of it, a bone-deep abscess rupturing and spewing everywhere. When I was done, Peter just laughed. That made me so mad I thought I would explode, or maybe kill him, or both. Instead, I cried. "If you'd shut up for 5 seconds," he said, "you wouldn't be crying now, stupid. I came to tell you Dad's alive." You know when people say they got the wind knocked out of them? Well, I felt like I'd been gored. Like some monster had taken a swipe at me and clawed out my entire abdomen so quickly and cleanly I couldn't even feel the pain. "I saved him, just so you know," Peter said. I didn't know how to read his face. That made me scared. Peter is my twin. I know him better than I know myself. To see something in him that I could not interpret set off internal alarms I didn't know I had. He wanted to die, and you wanted to help. Hospice. The disgust in his voice was palpable. He wanted you to burn him, and you were okay with that too. I was so confused and still so goddamned angry that I couldn't speak. He was letting himself die. That's what you don't understand. He was killing himself. Worse, he was killing us. "What do you talk like other people, pet? We're special. I can prove it. That's why I'm not sick anymore, see?" I could see. But that didn't mean I believed, and I said so. He said, "I can prove it to you. I need to prove it to you before you let yourself die. But you need to come with me." "Come where?" "Where I've been all this time. It's where Dad is too." The absence inside me, the part of me that had been gored by the monster, convulsed. I'll spare you the details of the fight that followed. I will tell you that Peter almost didn't win. I knew something was wrong with this. I knew it the moment I saw something unreadable in his face. He did win in the end, though. He won because my life was my family, because my responsibilities to my father and my brother defined me, because I was nothing without them, and because I was dying of the very same illness that had killed my father. Only my father wasn't dead. He was cured, so was Peter. They were better even though I was the one who'd taken care of them, the one who did everything. That's why Peter won, because I wanted to be cured too. I thought Peter was going to take me to some hospital or nursing home, maybe even some weird off-grid health spa out on the prairies. Where he took me was South America. I know that's a huge leap. Enough of a leap that I barely believed it even though I was there. I don't remember how Peter explained it. That happens when your brain rots. Even when it grows back, it doesn't grow back quite the same. Things fall through the cracks between your new synapses. The exact sequence of these events is one of those things. But here's what happened. Peter said Dad had a brother who was very rich, massively rich, the kind of rich that hides in the shadows to pull the strings of the world. This brother, Roy, was the patriarch. He owned a family compound, a ranch, way down south. They called it El País de Medianoche, midnight country. I didn't believe him at first. On top of sounding crazy as hell, Dad was an only child. That's what he always said, usually with an apology in his voice, as if he'd failed us by not having siblings of his own. Peter also said our uncle had the same disease we did. There was no cure, but there was treatment. The FDA banned it, and bringing it stateside would land every last one of them in jail, which is why they all lived in midnight country, so they wouldn't go to jail for simply doing what they had to survive. It sounds like bullshit now. It sounded like bullshit then, but I didn't want it to be bullshit. I wanted it to be true. If it was true, my father was alive. If it was true, I didn't have to die. So we packed up what I had, which wasn't much, and flew down to midnight country. When we landed, my first thought was I had never seen anything less midnighty. Stepping off that plane was like stepping into hell. The sun hurt, the heat hurt. It bore down from the sky and rose up off the ground in waves so heavy they felt physical. I could practically feel my skin burning. I was so miserable that I barely noticed when the driver arrived. When I did notice, I thought he'd made a mistake pulling up next to us because the guy was driving a Bentley. That was hard to see. I grew up in poverty. My childhood was stolen and my existence defined by illness-induced poverty. We were so broke that Dad and Peter had nothing but me. I had nothing at all. But this whole time, we'd family with enough something to pay a chauffeur to drive a fucking Bentley. The chauffeur drove us out to the ranch, chatting with Peter the whole ride. The tone of their conversation was unsettling. One of the shitty things about being poor is other people clock that you're poor. You can't help but clock the fact that they've clocked you, which makes you feel like you've inconvenienced them in some way, like your existence is an insult. You both know they'd prefer a world where they didn't have to look at you. I've been on the wrong side of that interaction since I was in kindergarten, so it was weird to see my brother on the right side. Almost as weird as seeing him look healthy. We arrived at midnight country about 2 hours later. From the gates, which were flanked by guard towers, it took another half an hour to reach the house. I understood why Peter called it a ranch, but ranch was the wrong word. It really was like its own tiny country. More watchtowers on the perimeters, fields as far as the eye could see, growing every kind of crop. More fields even beyond that, stuffed with the sleekest, most beautiful livestock I've ever seen. Beyond that was the employee housing. We're talking full-bore tenements, 3 stories high. There was even a little town for the workers, complete with shops, a school, even a little doctor's office. It was bizarre, but not as bizarre as the way every worker looked down and refused to meet our eyes. I'm telling you now, I thought it was a cartel thing. What else could it be? Giant ranch in a collapsing country in the global south? A worker pool the size of a big city, more money than the GDP of a small nation floating around? When I asked, Peter scoffed like it was the stupidest thing he'd ever heard. Think bigger. He escorted me through the manor. It looked like a Gothic mansion. Stone walls, old-world decor, lots of dark wood and rich carpets, and a kind of genteel maximalism everywhere you looked. I didn't meet my uncle or my father or any family members at all, but I did meet the servants. When they saw us coming, each and every worker stopped, dropped their eyes, and stepped aside to make way. When we finally reached my new room, I asked, "What the hell is this?" "Home. You'd better change. There are clothes in the dresser. Dinner's in an hour. I'll be back for you." He left. I checked the dresser. I won't bore you with descriptions, but each drawer probably had at least $50,000 worth of designer clothing. While I was going through it, heart rate rising in direct proportion to the price tags, someone knocked on my door. "Come in, Peter." It wasn't Peter. It was a servant, a girl, 20 at most, and heavily pregnant. Like all the others, she kept her eyes downcast. She carried a tray with a pitcher of water and a whole lot of ice. I'd never seen anything so beautiful. "Thank you so much," I said, and immediately started gulping. After I'd downed 3 glasses, I noticed she was sweating too. "Do you want some?" She shook her head. The tray in her hands shook slightly. I'm Petra. I know, she said, then hurried away. That was bizarre. Dinner was even more so. The dining room was vast, distastefully baroque and full. At least 50 people at 3 different tables, none of whom were familiar except, of course, for Peter. Peter immediately led me to the high table and introduced me to our Uncle Roy, who had a wide, pristine smile and perfect skin. When he shook my hand, his skin felt so warm I wondered if he was sick. "It's so good to finally meet you," he told me. "After all this time, I'm so glad you're home." Before I could answer, the servants streamed forward, laden with platters of meat or vegetables. Peter ushered me towards the lowest table, barely dodging the servers in his hurry. I stayed silent, trying and failing to listen. After the 3rd course, I mustered up the courage to ask, "Where's Dad?" I meant for only Peter to hear it, but I spoke into a conversational lull so my voice echoed. The servant closest to me, the pregnant girl, actually met my gaze. I didn't like what I saw there. Not at all. From the high table, Roy gave a smile that was perfect, practiced, and pained. "Has Peter not?" Peter jumped, flushing slightly. "He's still sick, Pet. He won't do what he needs to get better. We want you to talk to him, actually." "Okay," I stood up. "Let's go talk." Later, Peter shot a frightened glance at Roy, who simply smiled. "I want to see him now." Several of the servants were staring now. "He's in the hospital, Pet. We'll go tomorrow. Eat." I looked at Roy. He was still smiling. That smile frightened me, so I smiled back and ate. The next day, Peter refused to take me to Dad, claiming he was too sick for visitors. Instead, he encouraged me to explore the manor since it was now my home. There are a couple of rules. Don't engage with the house staff. They don't like it, and neither do we. It just causes trouble. Stay out of the kitchens and the work areas. And if you start feeling sick, tell someone immediately. Anyone. Me, family, a worker, whoever. Just tell someone. They'll know what to do. While exploring, the first thing I noticed was the kids. There had to be 30 of them, all running around. None of them would look me in the eye. The second thing was the manor itself. It was stunning, out of place, even anachronistic, but beautiful. A palace on the outside, a castle on the inside. The outside was even lovelier, oppressively hot, yes, but beautiful. I shrugged out of my hideously expensive jacket and took off for the fields. It took maybe 5 minutes to notice that someone was following me. I bided my time, slowing down incrementally before turning around. It was the pregnant girl. She immediately averted her gaze. "Hello again," I said. "What's your name?" "Leandra," she stammered. I felt a pang, wondering why she was afraid of me. Then I felt anger, because I knew the answer. Someone in my family had made her afraid. Finally, I felt an almost desperate urge to prove that I was different. Someone she didn't have to fear. "Want to walk with me?" She looked terrified. Utterly, wholly terrified. But she walked up anyway and fell into step beside me. It took a while, but this is what I learned about Leandra. She'd grown up in Midnight Country and had a twin named Leandro. The coincidence made me smile. Leandra and Leandro, Peter and Petra. She was stressed because the father of her baby wanted nothing to do with her, and exhausted because the working conditions were harder than ever. The field workers had the worst of it by far. Her brother worked the orchards. That's why she'd come outside, to check on him. I was so intent on the conversation that I didn't even notice when we reached the orchards. That's when I started to notice other things, like how the nearest worker gave me a look of utter horror before dropping his gaze and hurrying away, or how another one gave Leandra a glare that would have killed me, then spat and stormed off. How most of the workers bore scars that gleamed like ribbons of starlight under their sweat and the sun. Her brother was one of these. When he saw her, he came running, smiling at her and tipping his head deferentially to me. But at least he met my eyes. He dropped fresh fruit into her apron pockets, shooting me a guilty look as he did so. I shrugged and shook my head pointedly, which made him smile. Leandra passed him contraband from the kitchens. Leandro clearly needed it. He was slat thin. "You won't say anything, will you?" "Petra?" she stammered. "Of course not." They both beamed at me. I stepped away to let them talk privately, scanning the landscape. All the other workers were clustered at the opposite end of the orchard. They were all looking at me. Skin prickling, I turned away. On my home, I noticed more. Like how the guards in the watchtowers faced in, not out. how the patrols, each of which included at least one of my new family members, were all armed. Underscoring it all was the way any worker I encountered jumped, dropped their eyes, and hurried away. By the time I got back to the manor, I was furious. I found Peter in the courtyard, conversing with his own patrol, and dragged him to the side. "What's wrong?" he asked. "Did someone hurt you? Are you feeling sick? These aren't workers, Peter. These are slaves. Where do they come from? What are you doing to them? Are we in a fucking cartel? You don't understand. Make me understand, because right now it doesn't look like Dad hid these people from us. It looks like he hid us from them." He rolled his eyes and started saunter off. "If you don't tell me what's going on, I'll leave." That stopped him in his tracks. I waited under the sweltering sun, cringing as biting flies orbited. Finally, he said, "I think it's time for you to visit, Dad." My heart soared. "Can we go now, or do we have to wait for a driver?" "We're not leaving." "But you said he's not in the hospital." He glanced at his patrol crew, who were all pretending not to listen. "He's downstairs." Peter led me through the manor, but not along the sweeping halls or through any of the grandest rooms. He took me down side stairs and serving corridors, through narrow stone passages with walls that seeped moisture and mildew. Finally, at the bottom of 3 flights of winding stairs, we reached a long, low hallway, paneled not in wood or stone, but reinforced steel. At the end of the hall was a door. Fear eddied through my bones, rooting me to the floor. "What the hell is this? This is how you're gonna understand." He clamped a hand around my arm and dragged me forward, shoving my face up against the small security window. There he is. There he was. My dad, recognizable but rotten. Literally rotten, like a zombie, but worse. He wasn't frail and thin and bony either. He was powerful, built like a deformed ox, like his own muscles had metastasized into something beyond human. I screamed. My father looked up, blinking slowly. Then he launched himself at the door, hitting it with so much force the entire corridor shook. "What did you do to him?" I screamed. "He did it to himself. That sickness he has, that we have, this is the end result." He pressed me to the window again. "When we don't eat what we're supposed to. You know what happens when we do eat what we're supposed to? We're basically immortal." "I don't understand." "Try this then. When we eat, we're vampires. When we don't eat, we turn into zombies." "What are we supposed to eat?" He finally let go. "Remember the supplements? What he fed us kept us alive? They're illegal in the United States." "What is?" That's why he could never afford it unless he worked overtime. He was basically buying drugs. But it's legal here. They farm it right here in Midnight Country. It's free for us. Completely free. Always has been. Always will be. All he had to do was come here and take it. "Is it permanent? What's wrong with him?" Peter hesitated. For the second time, he wore an expression I couldn't read. "It's not permanent," he said. "If he eats. That's why we wanted to bring you here. To see if you could help." "How?" Peter shrugged. "At first we thought maybe bone marrow transplants, but bone marrow? A bone marrow transplant? Is that the only reason you brought me here?" "No," he said, but I knew by his tone that he was lying. My heart broke. No one brought me here to help me. No one brought me here to save me. Peter only fetched me to play caretaker yet again. "Then what?" I asked. "You want me to talk to him? He's like an animal." "He's a lot more than that, just like you and me. Let's go. I wasn't supposed to show you this. We have to get back upstairs." I was in no condition to argue, and I certainly wasn't stupid enough to say anything to anybody. But when Roy smiled at me across the hall at dinner, I averted my eyes. And when the serving staff brought out the meal, I didn't eat a single bite. I avoided Peter after that, and the rest of the family too. Instead, I talked to the only other person in Midnight Country who'd acknowledged my existence, Leandra. She was incredibly sweet, so was Leandro. No one else. The other workers avoided me. Most wouldn't even look at me, although I caught one glaring at me from across the field more than once. A couple more spit as I passed, but I couldn't blame them. Not based on what Leandra told me. She confirmed all my worst fears. They were serfs at best, slaves at worst. Most of the people in Midnight Country had been born here. Most of their parents and grandparents, too. And there was nothing to do about it. My uncle bought off law enforcement, military, rebels, and splinter groups alike years ago, and all left him to his own devices. he operated with complete impunity. For all intents and purposes, the ranch was a tiny, self-sustaining country complete with exports. Leandra constantly expressed concern for her brother, and especially for her baby. She didn't want her to grow up a servant. She wanted her to be free, to have her own life, to have a chance at something that wasn't this. I thought back to my life, the illness, the poverty, the inescapable responsibility, and privately thought I understood. When I wasn't with Leandra, I was sneaking down to the steel corridor to see my father. I guess I hoped my presence would trigger something, his sense of self, his paternal instinct, anything. But there was never any recognition, never any improvement that I could see. He just seemed to get stronger and steadily more insane. That didn't stop me from visiting. One afternoon, I arrived to find a second visitor. It was my uncle. I froze. "By the time we reach the state your father is in, we're voracious," he said conversationally. "We'll break down walls for a scrap of meat, but he tapped the glass. He won't even eat what's right in front of him. Peter explained the issue, didn't he?" "Don't be mad at him," I said. "I made him tell me." "I know." He was smiling as always. "Normally we would force your father to eat. It's been done before. We restrain them, pull them from their cell, feed them, and put them back. Repeat until success is achieved." His smile grew wider as if he expected a laugh. "But your father, something went wrong. Something we don't quite understand. Now he's too strong to restrain, too powerful to let out, even under strictest control measures. In his current state of mind, at his current strength, he'd destroy everything, including you." It was hard to look at him, but even harder to look at what remained of my father. "Why are you telling me this?" "Only explaining the consequences of a jailbreak." I felt a lump in my throat. "I'm not planning a jailbreak. I didn't think you were. Peter said something about bone marrow transplants. That was our hope, but I'm afraid he's beyond that kind of help." "Then how are you going to help him?" "By making him a meal he can't resist." He peered through the window, frowning as my rotting father snarled, "Let's leave him to it. It's almost time for supper." I followed him up to the dining hall. When I headed for my usual seat at the back of the room, he put a hand on my shoulder and steered me toward the high table, pressing me into the seat on his left. Supper was the most extravagant meal I'd had since my arrival, which was saying something. I didn't want any of it, but I didn't have a choice. Although my uncle spent the meal conversing graciously with everyone else at the table, he watched me eat. Every time I caught his eye, he smiled. When I got back to my room, I paced anxiously, waiting for Leandra's nightly appearance, but she didn't come. Instead, it was a maid I'd never met before, one who refused to meet my gaze. "Where's Leandra?" "Sick," she mumbled and ran away. 100 awful scenarios ran through my mind, most too hideous to acknowledge. I shrugged into my coat and crept out of my room and into the courtyard, dodging workers, family, and children alike. Then, praying nobody would notice, I hurried down to the worker tenements. Leandro answered. He immediately tried to shut the door, but I forced my way in. "You can't be here," he said. I darted past him. "Where is she?" His face darkened. I hadn't known his sunny, smiling face could darken like that, and I knew he wanted to stop me. I also knew he didn't dare. I found Leandra in a tiny room off the small kitchen. For a fraction of a second, she recoiled. Then she smiled. "I'm glad you're here," she said. I sat on the corner of her bed. The blankets were soaked in sweat, and so was she. Her skin had an awful grayish tint made even more ghastly by the harsh lights. Leandro barged in, wide-eyed and angry. "She can't be here." "She's the answer to our prayer. Petra, I need your help," she told me. Her brother shook his head. "We need your help," she pressed on. "Leandra! You're not one of them, Petra, even though they say you are. They're lying. They brought you here to kill you." Leandro swore. "They eat their children here. It's how they live and why they're strong. They eat the half-bloods, girls first, boys second." I hadn't even realized I was on my feet until she grabbed my hand. I twisted away. "If it's true, why do you let them?" "We don't let them. It's what they take." "Why don't you leave?" "Try to leave," Leandro cut in. "See how well it goes for you." I thought of the watchtowers and the armed patrols. "Why don't you fight?" "With what?" Leandra's hands tightened on mine. "When they don't eat, they become like your father. Mean, mindless, impossibly powerful, impossible to control. They've been trying to feed him for months, but he won't touch any food. The only food they can never resist is their own blood. That's why they brought you here, to feed him. I don't believe you. Except I did. That was my entire life, wasn't it? Taking care of my brother and my father at my own expense. Why would this be any different? But your brother wouldn't let them try. Not even to save his father, because he loves you, because you're his family. Leandra patted her belly. Instead, they're going to kill her. I need you to remind Peter that she's family, just like you. Remind him. I couldn't look away from her. Her sweat-soaked nightgown, her swollen stomach, the bloodless undertone of her skin. What do you mean? My baby is his. She's Peter's daughter. She's his second child here. Is that why all those children had run of the property? A ranch of bastard sons and bastard daughters raised to, please help me escape with my baby. She's your niece. Please help your niece. Where's Peter's first child? I asked. Ask him how he got so healthy, said Leandra. I did. I don't want to talk about that conversation. I will tell you he admitted everything. He didn't even ask how I knew. He just begged for forgiveness, then promised nothing would happen to me or to him. They tried to use me for Dad when I came here, but he wouldn't touch me. That's how I knew he wouldn't hurt you either. He loves us too much. We're safe here, pet. This is where we belong. Even though our uncle didn't know it before, he knows it now. The next day, I went back to Leandra again and apologized. Don't apologize, she said. Do something. What can I do? Let your father out. How would that? He hates them, Leandro said. He hates all of us, but especially them. So, starvation kills us, but it makes you stronger. Death makes you stronger. Your father is dead. He can't be killed. He can only kill, and he's so strong they can't stop him. If you let him out, you'll save us all, including our niece. After that, I went to my brother for the last time. He took me to the control room for privacy's sake, making sure the PA system was off before we spoke. If this is true, I asked, why didn't we die when we were kids? I don't know about you, but I don't remember drinking blood or eating human organs. You're telling me it was those supplements? Partly. Peter slid his hand across his wrist. And partly because Dad fed us with his own blood. That's how it works for our family. Blood feeds blood. He fed us. There was enough to keep us alive. There just wasn't enough of him to keep us healthy. I had that sense again of being gored so thoroughly that pain was an impossibility. That's why I stole Peter's keys. I found Leandra. She'd given birth overnight. But when I showed her the keyring, she smiled so brightly and tipped the infant into Leandro's arms. Together, we went down to my father's cell. I wanted to let him out. I had never wanted anything more than to let him out. But when I looked through the security window, when he saw me and launched himself at the door with enough force to shake the floor, my resolve failed. If I opened that door, he would kill me. Please open the door, Petra, Leandra begged. You're his daughter. He knows it's you. He didn't hurt Peter. He won't hurt you. But I knew, looking into his eyes, that he would. I wanted to help Leandra, desperately. I wanted to stop this. I wanted to burn Midnight Country to the ground, but I didn't want to die for it. Leandra must have sensed this because she shoved me aside, yanking the keyring away with such force the heavy iron broke my finger. Then she unlocked the door. My father barreled out and immediately took a monstrous swipe, snapping her spine and sending her to the floor in a bloody, boneless heap. Then he turned to me. He came forward, raising an arm, only to caress my face. His suppurating skin left sticky residue behind. Then he ran. I followed, but he was so fast I couldn't catch him. I could only see what he left behind. Devastation. Screams echoed through the stone halls, slinking and leaping between surfaces like living creatures. I slid after him through warm pools of blood. Pieces of relatives and servants alike covered the floors. Their heads in particular were bloodless and waxy. At some point I smelled fire. The screams kept coming, dancing and bouncing like invisible monsters, having the time of their lives. So did announcements over the PA system, deafening warnings crackling through hidden speakers. I tracked the shrieks to the kitchen. It was an abattoir. I saw my father at the far end attacking the staff. "Dad," I said, but my voice came out a croak. He tore the head off a chef, then barreled into the dining room. Through the swinging doors, I caught glimpses of the carnage beyond. My father, leaping onto the table, snapping the spines of the diners, hurling body parts and crystal platters across the room. I saw my uncle try to fight him. I saw him lose. The sight of him crumpling to the ground galvanized me, shocked me completely out of my daze. I turned and ran, past lakes of blood and death, past smoke and fire, past piles of human confetti, until I reached the control room. The PA system was already on. All I had to do was speak. "They're dying. They're killing each other. Run." In the distance, I heard my father's monstrous bellowing. I ran, out of the control room, slipping across the blood-slick halls, all the way outside. Fires rose everywhere. Flames erupted from the windows. Glass shattered across the lawn like an ice fall. Shadows cavorted like demons. Smoke blanketed everything. At some point, I noticed the workers weren't running anymore. Some roamed the grounds with machine guns, gunning down my surviving family as they tried to flee. Others looted the employee store, some simply danced and sang, others fought each other. One of those noticed me. He grabbed me, dragging me into a ring of men and flung me to the ground. Leandro was among them. I begged for help, expecting to see the warmth in his eyes, or at least pity. But I only saw disgust. "Let her go," he said dismissively. "She helped my sister. She's one of them." He smiled at that, but there was no warmth in it, only dark fire. "Then give her a head start for my niece." I ran. They followed but quickly gave me up for other quarry. And there was a lot of other quarry. Aunts, cousins, all of them shinier and fuller and healthier and much more beautiful than me. By morning, Midnight Country burned to the ground. What remained was a war zone, complete with random machine gun rounds and explosions and fire and screaming people and crying children and blistered, shell-shocked men stumbling through the ruins. Over it all, I heard my father bellowing. I crept into Leandra's quarters and found her daughter. My niece, I took her. Not out of kindness, not out of goodness, because blood feeds blood. I took her and never came back. Sometimes I wish I'd stayed. I would be dead and who knows where she'd be, but I wouldn't have inherited everything, which means you wouldn't have found me. That means I wouldn't be here. And I wouldn't be what I am.